Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name's Dana Yanocha. I will be moderating today's session and really excited to have a great panel of speakers and have you all here to contribute to the discussion. So as far as the agenda goes for today, we're going to be focusing on the topic of low emission zones. ITDP just released a new report called the Opportunity of Low Emission Zones. So we'll just be giving a brief overview of that report and encourage you to take a look at that on ITDP's website. Then I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers and we'll have a moderated discussion. And we'll save a couple of minutes at the end for questions from the audience. So before we jump into the agenda, I just want to give a couple of notes on logistics. For some of you, this might be your first Twitter space. So I like to think of these as sort of a live podcast. So this is an audio only space. Today, only our designated speakers will be speaking, but as I mentioned, we'll have some time at the end for questions from the audience. So if you do have a question during the Q&A, you can raise your hand using the emoji icon at the bottom of your Twitter Space panel. So that is the heart with the little plus sign. If you click on that, there's a raise hand emoji, and you can use that to let us know that you have a question, and we'll go ahead and unmute you. Only folks joining from the Twitter app will be able to come off mute and speak. So if you're joining today using a computer, you unfortunately won't be able to speak during the discussion. So if you do have a question, switch over to the Twitter app on your phone. Last couple of things, there are some accessibility options available within Twitter Space, including live captioning. You can access those through the settings menu, which is the three dots at the top of your Twitter Space. And there's some other options in there as well. And then throughout the discussion, we'll be pinning tweets in the space. So you can take a look at various different reports from our speakers or other links or tools that we mention. So please follow up on those links if you're interested. And then finally, we are recording today's space. So you'll be able to listen to the whole conversation after the fact or share it with others who couldn't make it today. And that recording will be available through the ITDP_HQ Twitter account. So with that, I'm just going to quickly go through the new report, just a couple of key highlights before we bring our speakers into the conversation. So this report is sort of a companion to a larger report that ITDP released back in 2021 called Taming Traffic. In that report, we pulled together background and sort of guidance on a whole host of policies that help to reduce demand for driving. So everything from parking reform to congestion pricing, low emission zones were included in that, as well as sort of street redesign and reclaiming street space from cars. But of course, the broad context here is that the use of fossil fuel powered vehicles contributes to poor air quality, contributes to emissions that cause climate change, and also contributes to a whole host of other negative outcomes like traffic injuries and deaths. And this is especially true in cities that are experiencing rapid urbanization, right? So we have a lot of evidence that shows that to effectively decarbonize the transport sector, cities are going to need to adopt policies that both enable people to reduce their travel by single occupancy private vehicles, as well as shift to low or preferably zero emission vehicles for trips that still require a vehicle. So it's really in this context that low emission zones are growing in popularity as a way to get at that potential for emissions reductions. So there are more than 320 low emission zones operating in Europe right now. That's a 40% increase since 2019. So lots of cities in Europe implementing these types of policies as a way to address air quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's worth noting that these sort of European style low emission zones haven't been as widely replicated outside of Europe, but there is interest in this. And we're going to be hearing today from a number of cities that are really kind of at the forefront of designing and adopting these policies outside of Europe. So in the report, the first thing that we do is actually to provide a definition of a low emission zone. So according to ITDP's definition, a low emission zone has two components. So the first is that it restricts the use of polluting vehicles. And it does that either by setting a price to enter the zone that varies based on the emissions level of the vehicle, or by banning the highest polluting vehicles from entering the zone altogether. And then the second component is that it exists as an actual contiguous zone. So it should be, an area that is large enough that drivers can not avoid it, and large enough that benefits are going to be discernible at a larger scale. So then we take a look at some of the outcomes that have been observed as a result of low emission zones, primarily in Europe. So there is a lot of variability in terms of the impact of low emission zones on different air pollutants. But overall, LEZs are pretty strongly linked to improved air quality. Obviously, the size and other design elements like the level of enforcement, and of course the presence of alternatives like high quality public transit, bike lanes, sidewalks are all going to contribute to how significantly a low emission zone is actually impacting air quality. And then we also look at some potential other outcomes like revenue generation for priced low emission zones, and fleet turnover. So thinking about how low emission zones might encourage the uptake of cleaner vehicles that comply with the low emission zone. And then finally, after kind of going through this process of defining a low emission zone and looking at the impacts that have been observed, over recent decades, we really make the case for low emission zones as a broader opportunity for cities to achieve goals beyond just improving air quality, although that's obviously a key feature of low emission zones. But depending on how the low emission zone is designed, it can also help cities get to other goals like improving access, improving street safety, and even addressing some equity concerns. So I'll just stop there and definitely want to dig into some of these points a little bit further as part of the discussion. And of course, there's a lot more in the report itself, so I encourage you to take a look at that as well. So let's go ahead and hear from our speakers for today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. So just let us know your name, your title, and organization, and then just in a couple of minutes, describe kind of how your work intersects with low emission zones, or maybe how you see low emission zones as an opportunity based on the work that you're doing. So let's go ahead and start with Zoe from C40.
Hi. Yeah, thank you, Dana, and thank you to everyone at ITDP for having me here today. As Dana said, my name is Zoe Allen, and I'm the Zero Emission Vehicle Manager at C40 Cities. And for those of you that don't know C40, C40 is a network of 97 cities, and we work with those 97 cities on strategy and implementation of ambitious, equitable, cross-cutting climate action. And as part of the transport program, which is where I'm based, obviously, on zero emission vehicles, we provide cities with support and with peer learning opportunities and connections to each other on all measures that can take harmful and polluting cars off the city streets and replace them where we can with walking, cycling, and public transport, and when necessary and when we can't with zero emission vehicles, very similar to what Dana was saying a minute ago. And I'm really pleased to be invited to join this conversation and talk to you all today because low emission zones and particularly as a what we call stepping stone policy to zero emission areas are something that we see as a very, very effective way to achieve this vision that I'm talking about of no harmful polluting cars, walking, cycling, public transport, and create streets that are greener and safer. And in the report, it was very nice to see C40's Green and Healthy Streets Accelerator mentioned, because it's something that we're really proud of and really proud that our cities are working towards. And this is a commitment that 36 cities have signed, which commits them to procuring only zero emission buses from 2025 and ensuring a significant area of the city is zero emission by 2030. And as we're now sitting in 2023, we now only have 7 years to go until we get to that goal of 2030 for the zero emission area commitment. And we are seeing and helping our cities to really scale up that action around policies like low emission zones with the aim of getting towards that goal by 2030. And we know that that is what cities need in order to create cleaner air and see a really big range of co-benefits, as Dana talked about. And I just want to say that when we talk about green and healthy streets and when we talk about zero emission areas, at C40, we're really talking about a holistic vision of cities that have these policies about restricting vehicles. But as I said, they should also really think about the wider sustainable transport system, and even more broadly than that, about the better way of life they're creating for their citizens, for their residents, and kind of creating cities that are more connected, more equitable, more livable, better for everyone who lives there. It's not just about vehicles, it's not just about electrification, it's not just about restrictions either. Thank you everyone.
Thanks so much, Zoe. I definitely want to come back to you and hear a little bit more about some of the cities that are participating in the Green and Healthy Streets Accelerator. I think that's a really great program that's really pushing for ambitious change in this space. So let's hear from Francesco next.
Hi, everyone, and thanks a lot, Dana, for the introduction and for inviting me. I'm Francesco. I work at LEZ Cities, a research center at the London School of Economics. I'm also based in London. I'm currently working on a program of research and engagement on innovation and governance in European cities, and I've been working in the on urban policy in Europe for the past couple of years, and also recently with a focus on urban mobility and transport in a previous role in Brussels. So urban vehicle access regulations, as they are often called, which is a broader category that also includes low emission zones, are indeed, as it was said, a key policy that many cities across Europe are pushing for, and they are introducing, and sometimes they are battling with, because this can prove to be also controversial for some parts of society. And so it's very interesting to be joining this debate and to talk about how this this policy is working in cities, because as Dana and also Zoe has said, there are many benefits on for the impact on health, and also on congestion, and also on, let's say, the climate ambitions that many cities have. But there are also very concrete challenges related to the implementation and the political aspects. So I'm very happy to join this debate.
Thanks so much, Francesco. Yeah, I think it's interesting that we are having this conversation amidst some of the, as you said, kind of controversial pushback, not necessarily on low emission zones, but broader sort of low traffic neighborhoods and in some cities in Europe. So interested to get your perspective on that as part of the discussion. So thanks for joining. Let's go on to Santiago.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. My name is Santiago Fernandez. I'm Urban Development and Research Director at the ITDP Mexico office. So in this office, we work a lot on low emission zones just because we realize that there's a lot of potential by trying to push for not just one policy, but maybe a set of different strategies and policies and regulations that can work together to actually achieve zones that are more equitable, more environmentally sustainable, and also more accessible. So on that note, we've worked in several Mexican cities, mostly in Mexico City, trying to implement various types of low emission zones. Maybe that's a topic we're going to discuss, what it's actually, what defines a low emission zones and how that varies among different places. I was talking about the European way of doing things, but there's also different approaches, no, in the other, especially in countries from the developing world. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here and talk with you about this topic.
Great, thanks so much, Santi. Let's go to Michael from Indonesia.
Hi everyone, good evening from Jakarta. My name is Michael. I'm a transport associate at ITDP Indonesia office, and I'm the PIC for a low emission zone project that we are currently doing for the national guideline development and also implementation roadmap development for Jakarta. And also I'm currently doing some low traffic neighborhood project that have similarity with the low emission zone. Happy to be here to share and learn more about the low emission zone.
Thanks, Michael. And last but certainly not least, Parin.
Thanks, Dana. Hi, everyone. My name is Parin Visariya. I'm with ITDP based in India. Air pollution has been a major concern in Indian cities, and a lot of Indian cities have adopted electric vehicle policy. And many of the policies do mention about cities, the need for cities to implement low emission zones or green mobility zones. And right now, cities in India are at a point where they are exploring, starting to look at what will it mean for Indian cities to implement low emission zones. And we at ITDP in India have started working on low emission zones, and looking forward to this discussion, getting different perspectives from each one of you that can inform our work in India, and also happy to share our experience so far. So looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Parin. So as you can see, we have quite a diverse set of speakers here representing a number of different cities that are kind of approaching low emission zones from different angles. But I wanted to start out on the idea of sort of what really is a low emission zone and how are cities thinking maybe differently about what low emission zones can actually achieve. Historically, low emission zones have been really directly tied to, air quality improvements. And that's, of course, still a big focus of most low emission zones that we see going into effect today. But some of our speakers have alluded to the potential of kind of broader sets of goals that cities are thinking about with low emission zones. So maybe I'll go back to Santiago. You brought up this idea of how low emission zones are defined and how they've been implemented differently in different cities in Mexico. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit more? And then happy to hear from other speakers as well. If you've seen kind of different elements of low emission zones coming into play in different cities, and how those are being connected to maybe different outcomes beyond just air quality.
Yes, absolutely, Dana. I think that's a really interesting topic. Well, to start with, there's been little progress in Mexico, honestly, around low emission zones. There's still a lot of hesitation, but where we have seen progress is usually when cities or authorities or NGOs that are pushing for this type of policies can do it in a way that's more contextually relevant to the specific city that they're working with. So what I mean is we define low emission zones as a set of different strategies, rules, regulations that can be either infrastructure or perhaps a pricing or even some restrictions. But the way they're actually implemented can vary. No? For example, we see some cities using parking as the way to move forward, no? Because that's a topic maybe they're more familiar with or that their citizens are more concerned about. Other cities, for example, do a lot of progress through pedestrianizing city centers, for example, or specific streets. And that's the way they can start pushing for other complementary measures. But in the end, I think that it's the way that you can build a narrative that actually communicates or that is very relevant to the people that actually live there and that they can relate to in their everyday lives. No, sometimes we cannot be too ambitious and say like we have to do X, Y, and Z. Sometimes we have to perhaps start with Y, see what elements of X we can bring into play, and design a strategy that's like, as I was mentioned, more contextualized. I don't know if I explained myself correctly, Dana.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. And this idea of really connecting the low emission zone design with the needs of individual cities, and those might be different from city to city. I want to maybe go to Zoe. You brought up the approach that C40 is using, which is to combine bus electrification with the broader focus on zero emission areas. So I wonder if you can kind of speak to how that approach has been, how cities have responded to that approach.
Yeah, happy to. I think it's really important to always contextualize this in the different type of contextualization here, but contextualize this in the broader transport strategy. And a zero emission area would never be possible without the electrification of fleets like the bus fleets and without the broader transition of other journeys to sustainable modes. And that's why I keep bringing up how important it is for us at C40 and when we work with our cities to think about it holistically and think about it as an improvement to the city and an improvement to people's lives rather than just a ban on or restriction on certain types of vehicles. And I think this is really closely related to what Santiago was saying, because it's about communication. It's not so much. It is about the policy, but it's more importantly about how it's communicated and how it's perceived by people. And it was rightly pointed out that the air quality is often an entry point, but it's not always the entry point, and it does need to be specific and related to the cities that are implementing it. And we talked about Mexico, but there's also, for example, in the US, the entry point is often safety concerns, the amount of road deaths in the US, and need for neighborhood and community improvement, particularly post-pandemic, as the driving force behind policies like street redesign and possibly, hopefully in future, some forms of low emission zones in the US as well. So it's kind of about bringing all those elements together and again, bringing in that narrative that works for that region. And I don't think a narrative that only talked about restrictions would ever be very successful, which is why it's really important to remember how broad a policy this is and how different it can be in different areas as well.
Thanks, Zoe. I want to go to Parin next. You brought up, Parin, and we've talked about this before, how policies in India are really focused on electrification of vehicles. So can you talk a little bit about how the ITDP India team and your partners are thinking about low emission zones in the context of a broader focus on electric vehicles, and maybe how low emission zones can work as kind of a way to shift some of the focus to a broader set of goals?
Sure, Dana. So firstly, we have just begun our work on low emission zones, and we hope to interact with cities more as we approach them towards helping them to create a roadmap for the low emission zones in the city. So far, apart from ITDP, there are other organizations that are also working on low emission zones with various other cities in the country, and each one of them exploring how it would mean to implement a low emission zone in any of the Indian cities. While the electric vehicle policy, the intention of mentioning low emission zone or green mobility zone comes from an intent to accelerate the transition toward electric vehicles, and there is hardly any other mention of other alternatives in terms of other zero emission modes such as walking, cycling, and the need for other strategies such as parking management, which also links to the problems of congestion and so on, which is also equally important for us to address in Indian cities. While the EV policies do not speak much about it, but the various organizations that are working with the cities are bringing to their notice that it's not only about the uptake or the transition toward cleaner vehicles, but also about us investing in other initiatives which will ensure equitable access and enable everyone to access the area. So hence, we are bringing into the notice that the cities also look at walking, cycling, and looking at reducing trips of single occupancy vehicles, and hence the need for parking management and so on. So that's been the case. Also, various other organizations are making sure that they are interacting with the communities, getting their perspectives, and engaging from the community right from the beginning is helping to progress on some of the works, especially with the recent effort in Udaipur that we heard from ICLE, that has helped them to move forward. So engaging with community is equally important, and what is the benefit for them is important to discuss with them as we begin working on it.
Thanks, Parin. I think that's really helpful context. I want to encourage our speakers to, if you want to respond to anything you're hearing, feel free to just jump in. You don't have to wait for me to cue you. We want this to be, as free-flowing a discussion as we can get. So please feel free to respond if you want to make a point. But I'd like to go to Francesco. When we think about low emission zones, obviously London has been a real leader in this space with the original low emission zone and more recently the ultra low emission zone. So can you tell us a little bit more about kind of how that experience has been, and maybe what other cities might be able to learn from how London has approached its low emission zone, and what and what those goals have looked like.
Yes, sure. As you say, London is considered a true leader when it comes to low emission zones. You mentioned that the first one was introduced some time ago. It was, I believe, 2008, and then this scheme was expanded gradually, which is something that happens also in other cities. This was expanded gradually until it became what it's now called ultra low emission zone, the LEZs, because people here love acronyms, in 2019. So the stated objective was, as we have said, to cut air pollution, to improve air quality. The numbers, because many people live in London, the numbers that were presented by the mayor, by different mayors, were about premature deaths attributed to poor air quality, and also the very high number of people that suffer from asthma or other respiratory diseases. So in a way, this policy was set to cut pollutant and therefore avoid thousands of premature deaths. Why it's so successful? Because, well, the numbers say that London has been very successful in this past decade in improving dramatically air quality, and also congestion and noise on so many levels. This can be said to be a very successful scheme. I want to stress something that Zoe mentioned, that this should be seen as part of a wider set of policies and strategies to improve mobility in the city. And it's no surprise that such a policy, such an ambitious policy, politicians can even talk about expanding it. Sadiq Khan was re-elected recently, also on the basis of this idea, although we are seeing now a lot of opposition, but he was re-elected. And in my opinion, it's clearly because London can rely on a very strong public transport system. So this can only work if public transport works, and in my opinion, can only be expanded if also at the same time you're signaling that people will have more and more options, and conditions to cycle and to go by public transport will improve, which is probably something that is challenging because, of course, mayors and cities can control specific aspects of city life, not all of them, and some things cost much more than others. So it's great to hear about the commitments that also C40 is supporting city to advance on the procurement of zero-emission buses. But what we see on, let's say, on the opposition to these schemes is the concern on the cost on lower income households, specifically in the peripheries. So I think it's something very interesting to follow in London and in other cities, as we experience this kind of divide, this dangerous divide also in the discourse between the central elites, let's say, and the peripheries, which can cause very different perceptions of these policies. I'm now talking from the very center of London in a very nice university campus, but perceptions away from where I am now are very different. You mentioned other cities. Indeed, there are many other European cities who are doing this. A city that is also doing it gradually is Milan, and has been expanding its low emission zone gradually in the past few years. But also cities who were not traditionally been working on this are doing it now. I want to mention, for instance, Krakow and Warsaw, the first two Polish cities to have announced very recently low emission zones, but also cities in Spain like Valencia and Barcelona. Valencia is the latest one, who are also doing this. In my opinion, it's good to focus on the intersection of of the policy objectives and not only talk about air quality, because that's undoubtedly working. but probably the opposition comes from other kind of concerns, and it would be good to also address these. For instance, by expanding public transport and by making it more accessible, as some cities are considering to do, or make it cheaper or even free for some sections of society.
And if I can jump in, Dana, also being based in London, and for those of you that aren't so familiar with the London context, as perhaps myself and Francesco being from here or being based here, London has recently released their data, their latest data on the impacts of the low emission zone, and I think it's really, really powerful to what Francesco was saying about how effective the ULEZ is. And the one that really sticks out, and the statistic that London uses very well in their communications, is how many children, in the latest data, children from over 1,300 schools breathing cleaner air. And I think to the point about communications that we were talking about earlier, it's not just about the effectiveness of this policy that this data shows, it's how well London uses this data and how clearly they communicate it that has made the ULEZ such a success and such a leader in this space. And really glad to hear Francesco also mention Milan, who are again a real leader that we work with a lot, and really should be held up there alongside London as one of the cities that are doing this really well.
Thanks, Zoe and Francesco. Yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear how that communications piece is being approached in London. I think that there has been a lot of success with how the benefits have been communicated, and I think that's obviously tied to the approval or lack of pushback broadly from residents in London. I want to go to Michael just to hear a little bit more about the experience in Jakarta. I know it's been a little bit of a different road with piloting the LEZ in the Old Town in Jakarta and kind of figuring out how to scale that up. So can you just talk a little bit about what the LEZ in Jakarta looks like and what the plans are for building on what's already been implemented?
Yeah. So in 2021, the Jakarta government started to implement a low emission zone, or so what they call it low emission zone in the Old Town area, which is a historic tourism area. What they do is to restrict vehicle, have public transport integration, and also street pedestrianization. But what they are actually trying to do is to cut the through traffic, that they only allow tenants and residents motorized vehicle that has to pass the emission testing initially. So I think that's the low emission zone branding comes from. But unlike London, it is a neighborhood scale low emission zone, and it's very relatively small area with the size of 0.15 kilometers square. Yeah, it's different from London that covers the whole town for the low emission zone and most part of the city for the ultra low emission zone. And yeah, unfortunately, they don't have a robust monitoring and evaluation system, and their main parameter are the air quality and the traffic data, which unfortunately does not taken regularly. It doesn't show any significant improvement from the air quality and also the traffic. I think it is because the size of the area that is relatively small. So yeah, I think it doesn't generate great impact for the air quality. And also there's still a lot of traffic violation where the motorized vehicle are still entering the area through the bus access. So what they could improve is to make the zone larger to reduce the air pollution. But because this is a tourism area where pedestrian traffic is very high, I think it is better to have more low traffic neighborhood there rather than a low emission zone. Because when you put low emission zone, like in London, electric vehicles are allowed because they don't generate any tailpipe emission. So what they can do is to expand the area and to really make the low traffic neighborhood scheme where they cut the through traffic and only allowing active mobility and also public transport.
And Michael, Jakarta is also working towards electronic road pricing. Is there an effort to link that to the low emission zone area, or are those kind of two separate policies?
Well, for right now, it is still a separated policy, but yeah, we also think the same, that it should be integrated policy. So maybe we could implement the road pricing as well as the low emission zone. So the circulating traffic after the road pricing implemented, it is only clean vehicles in that.
So I want to pick up on a topic that was mentioned a couple of times, which is equity. And there's been some critique of low emission zones and the fact that they either require people to replace maybe a older used high polluting vehicle with a newer expensive, lower polluting hybrid or electric vehicle, or kind of force people to shift away from driving without good alternatives. And that, of course, has implications for access. And so I want to go back to you, Santiago. I think you mentioned equity as part of some of the considerations that were being made around the low emission zones in Mexico City and other cities in Mexico. So can you just talk a little bit more about kind of how that conversation has developed?
Yes, of course, Dana. Well, yeah, the thing about equity is that it's very hard to define. And I think that to really understand how if a given policy such as a low emission zone is equitable, we need to think very clearly about how the cost and benefits are distributed. Usually when we think about how a low emission zone, for example, can affect people that travel by car, we need to also think about that perhaps, at least in the case of Mexico City and other cities in our region, they are very, very small minority. So we actually, this cannot just be like set in the air. I think that what we need to do is to actually try to map out who are the different actors that are being affected and how, and from there start to have a conversation. Because of course, different communities, different groups are going to be affected, but others can be, are definitely going to be benefited. In the case of Mexico City, for example, there were very big concerns about parking management, for example, and how that can make the accessibility by car to this area more expensive. But what we realized is that actually the people that travel by car and were able to pay for parking are already in the lower end of the income distribution. Whereas people that are forced to travel in other modes, and I say forced because they have no other alternatives, such as public transport, they were also paying for the cost of other people traveling by car. In terms of their health, in terms of like how automobility and congestion affects the movement of other vehicles. They were also, for example, affected in terms of road safety. Since like the cars are usually the main culprit of road accidents. So yeah, that's what I meant. We need to Sometimes these arguments can be done very simply, but I don't think that's the way. I think we need to actually speak about all the different costs and benefits of these potential policies, and actually think very clearly about who is paying for what, and are focusing a lot on direct costs. For example, externalities. Sometimes we don't think about those, but they are key. And I do think that low emission zones can actually achieve a better distribution of these costs and benefits. If we are actually careful about it, and we try to, for example, compensate if there's like a given group. For example, the groups that's usually thrown into the discussion is people with disabilities that perhaps they depend on a car. I think that we can actually develop tailored solutions for many specific groups, and try to be very intentional in achieving a more equitable distribution of costs and benefits.
Thanks, Santiago. Maybe I'll go to Francesco to maybe talk a little bit about how this discussion around equity has kind of manifested in London. I think, again, London is really held up as an example of the importance of investing in alternatives to driving in line with, launching the restrictions around a low emission zone. So can you just speak a little bit more to how you've seen that play out in London?
Yes, it's a great topic also, because equity, as I was saying, is usually used as an argument by the critics of this scheme. Something that also we at the LEZs talk a lot about in our lunch breaks, in our coffee breaks, because it's a very interesting place to comment what's happening in this city. I mentioned before that one of the reasons to push for this agenda is public health, and at the same time, sometimes the criticism comes from politicians or associations or groups of people concerned about the impact on families with lower incomes, saying people that earn less money, they need to drive a car, so they will be impacted the most by this policy. So the equity perspective, it's an important one to talk about, because if we look at air quality and public health, data show that actually the people who are the most affected by poor air quality live not in central London, but in the boroughs in outer London, so in the peripheries. And also the impact on health affects disproportionately lower income people from lower income backgrounds. So here, in my opinion, it's again about the narrative and saying who we do this policy for. As Zoe said, I think the mayor of London and here they've been very good also at personalizing this policy quite a lot, telling the story of the families and of the people who were affected by premature death. At the same time, again, I think we have to make an effort also as people who study these policies to engage more deeply into also the most critical aspects and make the case that this is about air quality, but specifically it's about protecting those who cannot afford to be sick and to cope with the expense and the burden of being sick and to be affected by poor air quality.
Thanks, Francesco. Any other responses or thoughts, comments from other speakers on this point before we go into some Q&A from the audience?
If I can just hone in on a point that both Santiago and Francesco made there, which I think is worth putting into words exactly, is that the status quo is inequitable. And as Francesco said, that's an inequitable burden on people who experience poor air quality and who those people are. Is an inequitable burden in who actually uses a car and who doesn't use a car. And I think it's worth remembering that the low emission zones and zero emission areas, perhaps in future, can and should, if well designed, be a solution to an inequitable system, not an additional burden on top of an inequitable system. And cities are capable of doing that, and they are looking to do that, and they are focusing on doing that. But it's just down to those things that Santiago mentions about specific policies for the groups, such as people with disabilities who need a specialized vehicle, specific policies that can support those individuals, as well as having the low emission zone and seeing those benefits for the wider groups and the wider society.
Really well said, Zoe and Francesco and Santiago. Thank you all for articulating this very complex point really clearly. So I want to just take our last couple of minutes here and open up the floor to questions from the audience. I'm going to ask Alphonse to help me out with this in terms of unmuting. So if you have a question for a specific speaker or just a question in general based on what you've heard so far in the discussion, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you and you can concisely ask your question. So I'll just wait a moment or two and see if we have any takers.
Good morning, everyone.
Hi, Nicolas. Go ahead. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicolas Solano. I'm a transportation planner at DION, an international consulting firm, and I'm currently working at C40 on a feasibility study for a low-emission zone in downtown Medellin, Colombia. Many of the low-emission zones that are being implemented around the world are based on restricting access to vehicles based on their age or basing on their emission labeling. I will first like to discuss the growing concern that there are certain goals that accelerate the transition to electric vehicles. And when projections are made, it can be seen that the other benefits, such as congestion relief, are not seen in the long term. First, what can we do so that the result is not a low emission zone, but a high congestion zone in the long term? Secondly, I would like to discuss the impacts of the logistics and freight change of these changes in central areas of cities. What strategies can be applied to prevent these logistic impacts? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nicolas. Any of our speakers want to take on either of those great questions?
I could speak a little bit around the importance of considering logistics and freight in low-emission zones. And I could maybe speak to this through the experience of Mexico City. So Mexico City during the pandemic implemented a very aggressive pedestrianization and strategy in the Mexico City center. They closed a lot of streets without, using the pandemic as an opportunity, but there was also a huge need to create alternatives for mobility. But they were done perhaps without, a careful analysis. There was no time for that. So what happened is that very quickly, the people that were mostly affected and that started to pick out against these measures were the people that own businesses there, many small businesses, which also maps into the conversation about equity. They just didn't have the alternative to move their goods into different times of day, or perhaps use different vehicles. So they were very concerned. They were very loud, and this group was the one that managed to roll back these policies, even if if done differently, it could have benefited them. So yeah, when we're thinking about low emission zones, this is a topic that we cannot just put aside. We need to be very careful about how we integrate the movement of goods. No, it's not only people; it's also goods, and how this movement of goods also gives economic support to these areas. So yeah, just to mention that they need to be very, very carefully planned and develop policies that also can make freight and the movement of goods more sustainable, but realizing that these types of this type of mobility has very specific needs. So yeah.
Thanks, Santi. Zoe, did you want to chime in as well in response?
Yeah, I don't mind talking to either points, but maybe I'll address the first question about the other co-benefits or possible risks that we could have from low emission zones. Since Santiago answered the freight question so well, I think this is an incredibly important point and something that we should be very, very aware of as cities design low emission zones, and that we really do not want, exactly as you said, Nicholas, we definitely don't want situations where every vehicle is replaced one for one with an electric vehicle. That is not a solution. There was an article today in The Guardian in the UK highlighting just how bad non-exhaust emissions from vehicles are, like tyre and brake wear, and that's just one small part of it, and that's a direct emissions impact that we would still have, and not even thinking about congestion and noise pollution, and the fact that all the other problems that we have with cars around non-communicable diseases, from the fact that people aren't walking enough, and the fact that lives that include walking, cycling, and public transport are generally a lot healthier. This is not a scenario that we want, which is why, interestingly, our definition for not so much low emission zones, but zero emission areas at C40 is slightly different from how ITDP defines it, in that that focus on not replacing vehicles one-to-one, and actually making sure that sustainable transport and improved livability and other forms of transport and well-being are forefronted in the design process is actually and should be central to a zero-emission area, rather than just the vehicle restriction part. And this is what we're working with cities to achieve, and this is how they want to think about it as well. Cities also don't want that one-to-one swap, and how they're achieving this is, as we've talked about, lots of policies that go along with it, lots of more improvement in walking and cycling, improvement in public transport, as well as designing the vehicle restrictions slightly differently. For example, in London, as you probably all know, we have a congestion charge zone as well as the ULEZ, and whilst the congestion charge zone does exempt EVs at the moment, it could in future not exempt EVs. They could be also classed as a form of congestion, as they are. So there is ways that we can scale up, and I see we get to a situation perhaps where we get zero emission areas where electric vehicles are allowed, zero emission vehicles are allowed, ICE vehicles are not. But then perhaps cities start to go one step further, where they start excluding those vehicles as well, or limiting the amounts of vehicles, as has been done, as I'm sure you know, Nicholas, in many Latin American countries, things like the Pico y Placa scheme, where certain types of vehicles with certain number plates are not allowed on certain days and some are. I think there are a lot of steps that cities are taking. And there is natural progressions from low emission zones that will allow them to solve these problems in future.
Thanks so much, Zoe. Great response. And I know we're at the hour, but I see we have maybe one additional question from Sonal. Do you want to come off mute and ask your question?
Sure. Thank you, Dana. This is a question to Francesco. In the expansion of low emission zones in, say, Milan or other cities in Europe, was there a prior history that the low emission zone built on? So, for example, I'm particularly talking about demand management measures that were already being implemented for personal motor vehicles. I'm just trying to understand what is that history that then makes the concept of a LEZ or a ULEZ acceptable to the larger public?
That's a good question. That's a good question. What makes it acceptable to the larger public? So the expansion. In the case of London, we also saw it with the low emission zone. That became the ultra low emission zones. The parameters just simply became gradually stricter and stricter. When it comes to expanding the area, expanding the scope, was about actually trying to include the area where the problems, the impacts of air pollution were stronger. So it's about targeting a wider section of the city to make the policy itself more effective. So it's probably the way I see it, in my opinion, is that the policy itself cannot really function if it only focuses on very central areas. So since the beginning, these are policies that are presented as gradual policies, and this means that they can be deepened and widened. So more criteria and also geographically wider geographical scope. I don't know if this answers your question.
Maybe, I think partly the reason I ask this is in many Indian cities, there's a lot of resistance to paying for on-street parking, and our on-street parking fees are very, very low. And therefore this jump, if you will, to lower, I mean, I just wonder about because you're mentioning gradual, I just wonder what needs to happen in order for it to become acceptable. So, yeah.
In my opinion, the first one is the alternative. It's the presence of the alternative, and we have to think that most people do not make choices because of the environment, but because of how easy it is for them. And some habits, we know that they are difficult to change, but it's not impossible. Actually, at the moment at the LEZ cities, there is a project that specifically targets car users to investigate how what could be the drivers to change behavior. But both in Milan and in London, I mean, we're talking about cities with a very strong and extensive public transport network. I think the only way that you can sell this expansion to people is by saying, look how easy we are helping you move around without having to pay a very high parking fee without being in traffic. So I think that component of strengthening the alternative and also telling the story of how hard you're trying to improve the alternatives should be, in my opinion, as central as the benefits on air quality.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Anil, and thanks, Francesco, for that response. So we are right at the end of the time here. So I just want to again thank our speakers for joining and sharing their expertise and experience. It was great to hear, especially from sort of leader cities like London, but also some other cities around the world that are really pushing for low emission zones and kind of expanding on the traditional design and implementation of these. So thank you all again for sharing with us, and thank you all for joining. We hope to see you at another space soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Take care, everyone. Bye.